Kevin Thornton,
I'm here.
Christopher Schmaltz,
Here.
Edmund Marcus, Jamie Colley,
Present.
Thomas Bush, Lawrence Hecker, Yolanda Herrera, Leticia Rodriguez, Roger Craycraft,
Here.
Chuck Dorr, Brian Keeley,
Present.
Joanne Sabah,
Muted, but here.
Bruce,
I'm here.
Bruce Wright, Dale Calvert, Carolyn Campbell,
Here.
Tom McGovern,
Present.
Melvin Cohen,
Here.
Sean Brown,
Present.
Michael Edmonds,
I am present.
Rachel Wilson,
Here.
Amanda Parkman,
Here.
Patricia Schwartz, Debbie Wainwright, Justine Hernandez,
Here.
Eva Romero,
Present.
Amanda Moss,
Here.
Abigail Okrent,
Here.
Karen Carl.
Here.
Tom Bush,
Here. Very good. Did we miss?
I'm sorry, I missed Mr. Arlen Colton.
Here. All right, is there anyone else who was missed in the roll call?
Over here, we have to do someone.
We did just get. Good. All right, thank you. And Paki, you can confirm our quorum, correct?
Yes, Mr. Chair, we do have quorum.
All right, thank you. All right, let's move into our agenda. Our first item, Paki will take, and we'll hear about the committee's operating guidelines, among other things.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome to all of you here in the room. It's nice to see some of you after 2 years, and thank you for those of you attending remotely, and thank you for your participation today. Before we begin the presentation, I just wanted to follow up on the email that I sent all of you last week with some pre-meeting information, just so that you could see what we wanted to do today. And I hope that you all had a chance to review the materials. So thank you for all the questions and requests for clarifications that I've been receiving. That's been very, very helpful. I also want to share that we do recognize that you may sense that the CAC operates a little bit differently than some of the other committees or subcommittees that you've served on. And thank you for asking those questions. The RTA is a public body, and for that reason, it's regulated by state law. And it does function differently than other committees that you may be serving on or have served on. So thank you for asking those questions, and we want to continue to move forward with that understanding. And then I just want to add that the Pag Rta Committee Guidelines that I keep throwing at you, those are used to guide all of our meetings. And, we're going to be covering just some very brief key elements. A lot of this information I know that you all know, but we just want to make sure that you understand that this is what we're using to guide all of our meetings. Today, most importantly, the focus of this presentation will be to review the rules of conduct. And I guess this might be a refresher for many of you, but it's also an understanding that this committee will respect these rules of conduct as we move forward. And then finally, I just want to thank Joanne Sabah for assisting the chair with parliamentary procedures. We may be turning to her for questions and requests for clarification as we move forward. So with that, I'll go ahead and dive into the presentation. My apologies, this isn't moving. One more? Okay, we'll just use the keyboard. I think I got used to being remote. I'm in person. Thank you, everyone. Sorry about that. So just quickly, the committee operating guidelines, rules of conduct. Again, promoting a culture of shared respect and courteous interaction, listening and being open-minded to all viewpoints and respectfully embrace disagreement, seeking to understand all the facts to shape opinions and forge sound decisions, and also seeking the truth to avoid sharing misinformation and false accusations. Again, these are just some key points to remind all of us, the expectation as we move forward. And then also to recognize that, as I mentioned earlier, the statutory and fiduciary responsibilities of PAG and the RTA. We are a little bit different than other committees. And then, of course, the professional roles and responsibilities to ensure compliance. So just wanted to touch on those, and then just to remind everyone that committees or individual committee members shall not interfere with administrative activities of the committee or the organization as we move forward. And again, some of these things in bold are things that we've been asked, and I wanted to make sure I followed up and clarified. So in terms of the rules of conduct, so the presiding officer role is the member of the committee with all the power and duties as delegated. Your CAC chair, Mr. Tom McGovern, has been appointed by the RTA board as the presiding officer of the committee and will serve at the pleasure of the RTA board. And thank you to those of you that had asked about that and were wondering why your chair is your chair. In terms of meetings and procedures, the bylaws say that the CAC needs to meet at least twice a year. The chair, however, can call for meetings anytime with proper notice. And as you all know, I've asked you to hold the first Monday of the month and the third as needed. However, nothing is ever confirmed until the week prior. So thank you for that. The chair's meeting responsibilities, I just want to touch on 10 key points about the chair's responsibilities. He has a responsibility to open and call the meeting to order, announce proper sequence of the business that comes before this committee. He recognizes members who are entitled to the floor, states and puts all the questions that legitimately come before the committee. He protects the committee from dilatory motions. In other words, anything that's causing a delay. He needs to keep the meeting going. He needs to enforce the rules relating to debate and those relating to order and decorum, which we'll be touching a little bit more on later. He also has to, he's responsible for expediting business in every way compatible with the mission of the committee, decides all questions of order, delegates tasks to any member of the committee, and then of course he declares the meeting adjourned. But just some key takeaways about the chair's meeting responsibilities. In terms of the general rules of decorum, please remember to address the chair as chair, refrain from speaking until you're recognized by the chair, and of course now that we're in hybrid mode, the chair will be looking, on the screen and here in person. If two members request recognition at the same time, the chair has the discretion on who speaks first. Please speak to the posted agenda subject under debate, and then of course refer to other members only in a respectful manner. Under the Roberts Rules of Order, which governs all the matters that are not covered by the bylaws, the chair can consult with the CAC's parliamentarian on any inquiries of members that members have relating to parliamentary procedure as needed. So as we mentioned earlier, we have Ms. Sabah available for the advice of the chair. However, please keep in mind that it's ultimately up to the chair to make those decisions, not the parliamentarian. Debate must be confined to the merits of the pending question and germane to it. In other words, please, stick to the issue that is being debated. Members can only speak twice in a pending question. So a member who spoke once can speak a second time only after the chair permits it, and also only after at least other members have spoken at least once. Where the chair knows that there are members with opposing views, the chair will alternate the recognition of members between those with opposing views as much as possible. The takeaway from this is just really, this is a large committee, so we want to make sure that, people are not taking over the conversation. And also we want to give opportunity for those that have not provided their input. Another one is, of course, refrain from disturbing the meeting. If someone wants to read from a source, such as a report, a book, an article, etc., they can do so without objection and with permission from the chair. If a member objects, however, then that member cannot read from that source and cannot have one of us as staff read from that source. Unless the chair permits. If the chair does permit reading from a source, they can do so as long as they don't abuse privilege. And by that, I mean, we have more or less a 2-hour time allotted for these meetings. So if you are available to speak on a source, please keep it as brief and concise as possible. Addressing each other by name directly, address all remarks through the chair. Robert's rule does advise against members addressing each other by name. And the reason for this is to keep the focus on the issues and not the individuals. However, here at the CAC, per our established custom, you can address each other by name if it's done in a respectful manner. And also, this is an opportunity, if you have a title, surname, or something that you prefer to be called, that's the time to let everybody know. So in terms of the chairs maintaining decorum, simply put, the chair is responsible for maintaining the decorum. He can interrupt a speaker if the decorum is not being observed. He can then direct the member to come into compliance. If a member does fail to come into compliance, the chair will take back control of the floor and continue the proceedings. So his role is just to keep things going. Point of order, this is something that came up at the last meeting, and thank you for all of you that needed clarification on this. A point of order is raised by a member or the CAC's parliamentarian if questions are of a non-relevant or dilatory nature. So a member can declare a point of order to interrupt the speaker, and only after being recognized by the chair can bring attention to another member who's failing to observe decorum. So what this means is that, a member can state a point of order when they want to address a violation of a state bylaw or a parliamentary procedure. Please keep in mind that a point of order is an announcement. It's not a viewpoint. It's not an opinion. And it's an announcement to say that you're feeling that something's not being followed. But it does require determination by the chair. In terms of enforcement of rules, the chair can interrupt a speaker anytime to inform them they are out of compliance. He can call a member to order, and usually there's a first and a second warning on that. Chair can make statements like, the member's out of order, the member will come to order, or that is not in order, something like that. Pursuant to Robert's Rules of Order, the CAC does have the inherent right to bylaw. And this would happen with the majority. Members of the CAC, as you all know, downstairs. So with that, that was just a quick refresh. All the questions that were.
We have a question from Ava.
Oh, I was going to ask, Paggy's mic just changed and switched out. So we lost the last thing that she just said before you opened it to questions.
Dr. Romero, can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, let me see if I can go back to, was it
Just
this
that-
slide or this slide?
Yeah.
prior? Okay.
I think it was just that. Yeah.
Okay, so I was just saying in terms of enforcement of rules, per Robert's Rules of Order, the CAC does have the right to enforce the bylaws and punish any offenders, which includes expulsion from the CAC membership. And this would happen with a simple majority vote of the members. And then I just said, as you all know, members of the CAC can be removed from the committee by the RTA board.
that answer that question, Ava?
Mhm. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I don't see any other hands up. So Paki, do you want to continue with your presentation then on the second part?
No, that was all of it combined.
That was
It was a
combined.
short and sweet.
All right. Good. Okay, thanks, Paki. I want to keep our process going here, and so I would ask if you would all continue to abide by those guidelines and procedures. Recognize that I am not a parliamentarian specialist. Also, I'm perfectly happy being addressed as Tom as opposed to the chair. And I hope that we can develop a system of communication here that's as informal but respectful as possible. And I did want to also thank the members who have been sending emails in asking for clarification or questioning issues. This is really helpful, especially prior to a meeting, so that we can address some of those issues and if necessary, in presentations and in developing our agenda, have items of current interest and importance for the rest of the committee to be available. The only thing to remember is that we are under, I guess what some would call very strict open meeting law interpretations here. And we want to make sure that we maintain our adherence to those rules as much as possible. Okay, let's go to item number 3, which is approval of our meeting summary from the last meeting. Paki?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I have 2 revisions to the meeting summary. The first is Mr. John Holden is no longer with CAC member. So he just needs to be removed. And the second item is any reference to Eva Romero, please change to Dr. Eva Romero and rather than Miss. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Are there, Eva?
Thank you for reiterating that, Paki. I just want to be clear, I'm perfectly fine with people calling me Ava, calling me by my first name, but wherever titles are involved, it's Dr. and not Ms. Thank you.
Understood, and thank you for letting us know that too. Any other changes or corrections to the meeting summary? Us.
It's spelled incorrectly on the first.
Yeah, I noticed that. I'm sorry I
Okay,
didn't
no
mention
worries.
it.
Thank you.
Correct spelling, MAASS. Hearing no other comments, seeing no other hands up, do I have a motion to approve the meeting summary? A motion from Tom Bush, a second from Arlen.
Mr. Chair, just for clarity, that motion is to approve as corrected. Right?
Yes. Yeah, as corrected during the discussion. Very good. All those in favor? Say aye.
Hi.
You're very clearly, but you. Okay, so I don't know if there's a possibility you can raise the volume.
Very good.
Thank you.
Ask and it shall be done.
Thank
All
you,
right,
Mr. Chair.
motion passes. We'll move on to our next item on the agenda. Is a report on any submitted public comments for this meeting. We did receive a number of comments. They were well apparently organized, and the primary request for each of these letters was that the guiding principles be revisited, and that we include in those principles climate change, equity, and mobility justice. Those words appeared in each of the 12 or 15 comments from the public that we received prior to the deadline. And so those were those comments. We don't address those directly during this item in the agenda, but it does come up a little later in our deliberations today, so I'm sure we will talk some more about it. And as far as I know, Paki, there are no other comments received other than those that I just summarized.
That's correct, Mr. Chair, at least that met the deadline. And I also wanted to add, if I may, Mr. Chair, that these comments will be posted along with the meeting summary.
Great, thanks. All right, we'll move on to item number 5 now, which is review of the statutory plan development requirements and the need for compliance of our adopted guiding principles with those requirements as we develop this next RTA plan. And Jim DeGrood will lead us through this conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, members of the CAC. I'm going to go and give a brief overview of the plan development, the guiding principles that we've looked at to date and how they comply or compare to state statutes that enable us. Let's see if I can get this to work for me now. There we go. At least it's partially working. That is not. There we go. Now I'm in sync. Okay, first, what you see before you is the framework that we have. It's a blank framework. It basically shows how we're going to lay out the plan. It's similar to the way the plan was laid out and presented to the voters in 2006. You will note that nothing is filled in. We have not made any attempt to try to identify specific projects on the RTA plan to date or the RTA next plan. All project requests will be subjected to the very same process of bringing them forward and making a recommendation by this body. And there is no funding allocation between modes or a commitment to any elements that has been made at this point. There we go. Actually, this thing is hopping around here for me. Okay. In terms of the next plan or the future plan components, we need to identify elements. That's a term that's identified in the statutes that we refer to. The elements have common characteristics, and they are viewed with certain significant change requirements as well. So we have to be mindful of that as we're looking at what the elements are. We also have to describe the elements by their percentage or weight in the plan as we present it to the voters. We are continuing to work on updated revenue forecasts. We'll need to do that repeatedly between now and when we go to the voters. We want to bring forward the best information we possibly can, make sure it compares to our slated projects that we wish to deliver. Basically, we all recognize that the economy is somewhat in flux at the moment. So those will need to be looked at. All projects in the elements need to compare or correspond to measurable goals. We are under federal guidance required to look at doing our plans with performance measures. In fact, that's something that was focused on in the most recent RTA performance audit. We'll talk about that in the next item. But you know, this is something that we need to look at against measurable goals: safety, air quality, congestion, any number of different metrics that we currently look at right now or may choose to. And we also need to look at what projects are eligible for funding under the statutes, and we need to make sure that we're compliant with that. But ultimately, the mix of projects in the future plan needs to be one that you all come up with that can be broadly supportable by the majority of voters in Pima County. Now, in terms of the transportation goals that have been adopted, in terms of developing a well-balanced plan, we'd identified, or this committee had identified, the need to provide efficient crosstown mobility. Again, that's a measurable goal, can be, and we have performance measures associated with it, as well as reducing congestion, improving transit ridership, reducing crashes at intersections, reducing wildlife-related crashes, improving the conditions of existing roadways. There are ways to evaluate that, and we do maintain these metrics. Provide safer bicycle and pedestrian facilities, maintain or improve air quality. That's the way the statute reads, and that is something that we model and then we test or monitor. Improving access to workplaces, and adding functionality to key corridors. So what I'll do is I'll go through these goals very quickly and look at specific passages in the statutes, and they're in Title 48, 5309. I know there'd be, oh, great, okay.
We're all gonna have to
What
share.
is it?
It's the statute that Mr. DeGroot just
Yeah,
referenced.
we can
and-
certainly, we'll post
And
it.
he pointed it
Yeah,
at me, so I felt,
Oh,
can I pass that around?
certainly.
There's 10 copies,
Yeah,
so
that's-
get cozy with your
yeah.
neighbors.
Anyway, and I will be reviewing them in this. So at any rate, in terms of transportation goals, we have identifying, reducing congestion and providing efficient crosstown mobility. The statutes permit us to identify named corridors and define transportation problems, goals, and needs for each of these corridors. Let's see if I can get this to work. Okay. In terms of reducing crashes at intersections and reducing wildlife-related crashes, the RTA statutes permit us to identify named corridors and define the transportation problems, goals, and needs for each named corridor. In terms of improving the conditions of our existing roadways, identifying, you'll hear this multiple times, identify the corridors and define the transportation problems, goals, and needs for each corridor. But we also have authority to determine the need for landscape buffers, noise barriers, pedestrian bypasses, multi-use paths, and other environmental measures relating to the regional transportation plan. In terms of providing safer bicycle and pedestrian facilities, I mentioned the need or the ability to provide for the needed landscape buffers, noise barriers. We hit that in the last item. We also have the ability to determine the mix of alternative transportation modes appropriate for the development consistent with the transportation goals and needs for each named corridor. So we have the latitude to bring those forth both as corridors and more broad measures.
Jim?
Yes, sir.
Excuse me. As I recall, the final item or the final bullet on our guidelines addressed this issue here. Could you flip back to that really quick?
You mean on the
Functionality.
functionality? Yeah, I'll hit that direct. If you
Okay.
mind, I will hit that specifically here in a moment. But I can return to that if you'd like. We need to look at improving access to workplaces, which includes identifying named corridors and defining the transportation problems, goals, and needs for each corridor. And then the final one here, having trouble with a sticky keyboard here, so I apologize. Here we go. And add functionality to key corridors. Allow, again, the identifying the needs for each and the goals for each corridor, the determination of environmental, economic, energy, and social policies to guide transportation investment decisions, and to determine the need for landscape buffers, noise barriers, pedestrian bypasses, multi-use paths, and other environmental measures relating to the regional transportation plan. So we have a lot of latitude under the statutes to add functionality. And we have administrative code and policies to support this. We adopted an administrative code in conjunction with the 2006 plan immediately after the vote occurred. Once we have a new plan and it's approved by the voters, the administrative code will need to be updated and amended by the board to add the new projects, elements, and guidance that is associated with the implementation of the new plan. As a part of our administrative code, we have what are called the policies, objectives, and procedures document. They're part of the administrative code, and we need to look at those as well to make sure that we're giving proper guidance to our jurisdictional partners in terms of how they deliver the projects. And finally, once the RTA plan is approved, implementation of the voter-approved project scopes will need to conform with the RTA statutes and policies.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask a question? Yes, Bruce. Jim, on the policies, objectives, and procedures, if what we come up with in our new recommendations are inconsistent with those policies and procedures, is the RTA board able to then modify the policies to conform with that or to put them into alignment?
Mr. Chair, right, absolutely. We would, if the board chooses to move forward with a slate of projects they're voted upon, then we would conform the policies, objectives, and procedures to match what was approved by the voters.
So a follow-up question, Mr. Chair. So we're not constrained by the current policies and procedures at this point. Is that correct?
I'm going to give you a qualified yes. We certainly, the policies, objectives, and procedures also relate to state statutes. So we would want to make sure that we were consistent with those. But yes, and we'll be giving you guidance on that if we see something that may potentially conflict with statutes.
Thank you.
But yes, we would update the POPs.
So Jim, just to clarify that, the administrative code that's referred to in the first bullet here is wholly developed by the RTA board. That is not a state mandated or somehow a part of the ordinance.
The statutes do call for the adoption of an administrative code. So it is referred to in statute. And we would present we as staff would develop the administrative code, recommend it to the board, and ask for their adoption.
Thanks. Yes, Tom.
I guess we did. Way back to the first policy, that crosstown mobility, improve crosstown. I thought we were in the business of mobility cross-region, not just crosstown. And so I'm just explaining, we probably did approve that, but I think it's far more limited than what I envisioned the overall scope of RTA.
Thank you.
Okay. I think that takes me to the end of my presentation. So I'd be happy to answer any additional questions.
Very good. Moss.
I'm sorry.
You said that for the policy objectives and procedures, that there's a state statute that these would have to comply with. Could you give us that state statute?
I think I understand. I think the question was, where do we have the requirement for the administrative code?
Essentially, or I'm just essentially curious, like where in the state statute do they have the outlines for what are the policy objectives and procedures that we will need to make sure that we're in adherence with? And I'm just looking for that state statute.
I don't know that I have a specific point of reference. We would have to look at what's being presented, make sure that we're consistent with the statutes.
So there's not Are there multiple state statutes that you could then point us to that we could just read for ourselves? I'm a little bit of a policy wonk, and so.
Mr. Chair, we have, I have state statutes that we keep track of. They largely reside in Title 48, but they also are referred to in Titles 28, 35, 41, 42, and I'm certain others that if I looked a little deeper, I would find relevancy, or relevant passages. So yeah, we would work to try to make sure that the policies, objectives, and procedures are all consistent with the variety of different statutes that are out there.
Okay, thank you. And could those get included as like an amendment to your presentation in the meeting packet?
I have no problem with that, yeah.
Perfect, thank you.
Mr. Chair, point of order. I know it is very difficult to hear people ask for if they don't speak louder. Or if can we please repeat the question? So that will be a very good response. I know what you're responding to. All right.
Thank you, Tom. I'm sure that's a sentiment echoed by folks online as well. I know that Crystal is trying to raise the volume whenever we have a low talker, like I tend to be occasionally, or a masked speaker. So, okay, I have a couple of questions online. Karen Carl is first.
Hi, the use of the word corridor seems to be embedded throughout a lot of the materials that I'm reviewing. I know what the word means, but does it have a certain term of art in the context of the RTA?
That's Mr. Chair, Karen, that is a good question. There are specific references to the term corridor in statutes. We view them typically as mobile or mobility paths that may be that are multimodal, that would be following, if you will, common origins and destinations across the region. In the first RTA plan, we identified corridors of mobility that we wanted to focus on. If you were to look at the RTA plan, you'd see on that plan a graphic that showed basically east, west, and north-south corridors where common movements, or that's mostly how our region is laid out, is on the grid system. And we were focusing on key corridors that had the opportunity to be expanded to include more multi-modes, transit, bike, ped, and vehicular, as well as looking at gaps in those. And that's what the first RTA plan really focused on, were those corridors of mobility, if you will, or movement. And in fact, that really drove the initial plan, was looking at that. I'm sorry, did I answer your question? I guess I went off on a tangent, so hopefully.
Well, as I understand it, it sounds like sort of a fancy word for road. I don't know.
Well, I would submit that corridors are should be multimodal, and I think that the statutes and the plan both speak to trying to accommodate multiple modes on each of our key corridors.
One other point I might add to that is that virtually every time a corridor is used, it seems to have regional attached to it. And I know as a committee, our discussions have largely been about corridors being travel pathways that are regional. That is, that they're relatively long distance, that have some more than just local connections, beginning and end. Okay, a question from Ava.
Yes, thank you. Returning to the beginning of this presentation, I wondered about how exactly the projects are solicited? Are they ranked by the regions from which they come in terms of their own priorities? And have all the projects been submitted at this point?
Mr. Chair, Dr. Romero, that's a great question. You'll actually hear a lot more about projects that have been submitted. We did have an initial request for project submittals from our jurisdictional members. Those were presented almost 2 years initially, although we did receive the City of Tucson's submittal more recently than that. They now have their materials or their project priorities incorporated into the overall list that we have, but there's been no effort to try to rank them. What we have done is we've looked at attributes and performance related matters associated with each of those. And Mr. Ellis will be speaking to those later on in this particular meeting. I know he began talking about some of them previously, but there'll be a more comprehensive review of them. But at this point in time, we have made no effort to try to rank them.
Are we concerned at all that when we do, my understanding is the task of this committee is to decide what projects will be prioritized. If we come up with something that is in disagreement with the jurisdictions, does that set us back?
I don't know how really to answer that. My expectation is that if this committee finds that there's a priority, that would probably be shared by the jurisdiction as well. I'm not anticipating a misalignment, but at this point in time, I can't speak to that.
I would add to that, Ava, that that's almost sure to happen. It's unlikely that our favored list will be precisely what one or more of the agencies involved would have preferred. Surely each of them who've given us projects that could by themselves equal all the money that would be available, that prioritization will be important. This is something that we're going to really rely on some communication with the Technical Management Committee to figure out as best we can. Ultimately, remember, our list, our proposed plan goes to the board for ratification after it's been also vetted multiple times with the public. So some of those if you will, policy issues about the sharing of the money will certainly come to light. And as I said, I guarantee that will happen. It's just part of, I guess, making the sausage here.
Mm-hmm. And is it possible to see how the projects are solicited?
I think some of that information may have been provided during the orientation, but there was a request from the CAC to each of the jurisdictions asking for their list of projects because we recognize that there's probably $10 billion worth of need in the community that could be identified. We asked each of them to limit the amount that they gave us so that they at least pared it down a little bit as far as priorities. And those are what you see in this list. So the list is a direct result of our request that they provide a more or less prioritized grouping of named projects. At the same time, we've had conversations about some of the other aspects of the plan, such as the what are we calling our?
Call it the categorical.
Yeah, our categorical project lists. So all of those also will need to fit in with these named projects.
What's the difference between named and categorical?
Well, the categorical projects are essentially pots of money that are used for a specific purpose, whether it's for safety, for bicycle and pedestrian safety projects, could be for other mobility type things. We had a categorical that was for transit in the last one, and we've moved forward at this point with those categoricals largely undefined, but at least starting with a list that included many of them from the current RTA plan. But categoricals means a category of projects in which a specific amount of money is requested from the voters, and then the usage of that money is also advised. That is, the voters know how that money will be used, if not specifically which projects would be used over time.
Okay, and I apologize if I missed it, but I also asked, have all the projects been submitted?
Mr. Chair, at this, Dr. Romero, at this point in time, we have received project submittals from each of the member jurisdictions. I do not believe that I could characterize them as all the projects that they wish to have delivered. There may be others that come up over time, but at this point in time, we have a response from each of our jurisdictions. And it is for the named projects. These are the projects that are particularly large in size and maybe corridors or specific very large dollar amount allocations, ones that would not typically fall under what we are calling the categorical elements. If I might to kind of follow up on what the chair mentioned about the categorical elements, there are blocks of funding that are their funds released periodically over the life of the RTA plan, allowing the jurisdictions to compete for them based upon emerging needs, for instance, safety. I know that we started out with a block of funding in 2006 for, I'll give you an example, pedestrian crossings. And over time, the jurisdictions identified priority areas, and we provided funding for that. As bicycle and pedestrian corridors are developed, we've seen elements of those implemented through these categorical funds over time.
Thank you.
I'm looking at this actually. A categorical. I'm reading component and I'm reading element, and I'm hearing us talk about projects and categories. If I'm just behind in the class and I don't understand the difference, tell me that. But I think that it's really important for me to understand what these things mean.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I would, when we talk about categoricals, that's probably a term of convenience that we use. They are elements. We have what we have done in the first RTA plan is we have a safety element, an environmental and economic vitality element, and a transit element that are all deemed categorical. In that, with the exception of the modern streetcar, we gave no specific projects to any of these particular elements, unlike the roadway element where we had, 22nd Street or downtown links. Those were specific named projects. In the categorical elements, they're typically smaller sized projects. We have sub elements. So for instance, under the safety element, we have a sub element that is for intersection improvements for safety and capacity. We have one for pedestrian safety. We have, or elderly and pedestrian safety. We have bridge deficiencies and railroad crossings, traffic signal improvements to improve mobility. These kinds of things are sub-elements. And I won't go any further into them, but that gives you the sense of it. And I would suggest that, you might take a look at the construct of the existing framework in the RTA plan that was adopted in 2006. And I think that may help fill in the blanks for you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to add all of the questions that Dr. Romero asked, and also Abby. We have that information, so I will make sure that you get the links to all of that information, the letter or the call for projects, Dr. Romero, that we sent out, and then also the different elements, so that you have a better understanding of that. There are some fact sheets we sent out that has a little bit of that information, but now that you're asking for specific things, I'll make sure that that goes out.
All right, hold on just a second. We have a couple of other questions ahead of you.
Can't hear what people are saying. for some reason. All right. When you're talking too fast, you're not. I can't understand the nature of what you're trying to say. All right.
Would it help to be a little more central, Tom, to the rest of the group?
No, well, it would, it's okay. I don't know why I'm having a problem. Matter of fact, my best hearing ear is facing you, so I can't imagine that. All right, no.
All right, we will attempt to we'll try to keep track of that. Feel free to raise your hand if I start mumbling, certainly, and if anyone else does, and we will have the volume up as much as possible. Just to repeat that last question, it was simply where in the statutes does the term categorical come up? And the answer, as you heard from Mr. DeGrood, was it doesn't. That it's a term that we've adopted as one of the elements or components of a plan. We have online a couple of questions, but first was Rachel, and then followed by Moss here in the in-person room. So Rachel, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Back to the question of whether all the projects have been received, and the answer was many of the projects have been submitted from each of the jurisdictions, but we don't know if all of the projects have been submitted. Is there a deadline by which the projects have to be submitted?
Yes, there was a deadline of June of 2020.
Yes.
Yeah, but since then, the city of Tucson was in the midst of its Move Tucson outreach, and has only recently, I guess, in the past several months, made their list available. But as far as the deadlines go, these were more or less arbitrary, I guess, at the time, so that we could try to get our work done here as a committee. And as far as I know, all of the projects that these jurisdictions wish to have considered have been submitted.
So is there a date final by which no more projects will be considered? I'm just a little confused at how there seems to be this rolling rolling deadline, actually, where projects are submitted after a supposed deadline. How will we know when all the projects are in so that we can try to work out some priorities?
All right, let me try to clarify. The projects are in, and we will be working on those. It'll be up to this committee to decide should a jurisdiction wish to modify that list at some point during our deliberations over the next, say, year. It'll be up to us to decide what to do about that. So at this point, the projects are in.
So all the projects are in then, because that's a little bit different than something you were saying earlier.
Yes, all the projects are in.
Okay.
Thanks. Okay, Moss.
Yes, thank you. And can you hear me okay right now? Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'll try to speak as loudly as I can.
I'm sorry, no mind.
Okay, okay, sorry. So kind of on this topic, I do just want to bring back some of the conversation that we had in the last meeting and about guiding principles and what's in them. You know, we are a new CAC, all of us, even though some folks were here in 2018, you know, we're reappointed in 2020. And several of us were also brand new. So I would classify us as a new CAC. And kind of given that, if I'm looking at the RTA's next step process wheel, which can be found on the rtanext.com front page, that the next step after being formed is to establish the plan priorities, so our guiding principles. I think that we have a good foundation with the 2020, as I'm calling them, kind of like the pre-pandemic guiding principles. But I really think that it's important for us to take the time, and even as Tom pointed out, having a clarification of terms such as cross-town mobility, what does regional mean, what do corridors mean, all these different things that, you know, could be further clarified, updated, and revisited. You know, with that too, a lot has changed since 2020 and 2019, and I think we owe it to our communities to understand that. Understand more of where they're at, and as well as what are the current regional transportation needs and priorities kind of in the aftermath, even though we're still living through the pandemic in a form, but trying to understand what their needs are after this really intense past couple of years, you know, especially since we know that commuting patterns have changed, excuse me, and, you know, equity issues have been exacerbated, you know, during this time period. We have talks through RTA during the orientation. It was made clear that we could revisit the guiding principles as long as it complies with state statute. And I think that, you know, this is really helpful. Thanks, Abby, for bringing this. But essentially, you know, really we're required to include a public transportation component. And there's a lot of may, among other things, include a lot of the stuff that you pointed out, Jim. And so with that, what I would like to, and given that we've now had, you know, 12 to 15 public comments asking that we revisit guiding principles to include things like climate change, which isn't mentioned currently. And given that we could have a catastrophic climate change event in the next RTA plan, given some of the UN reports that have come out, that I move that the new 2020 CAC set aside a few working sessions to revisit, update in the pre-pandemic guiding principles adopted in 2020 to ensure that these reflect post-pandemic transportation needs of our region.
Second that.
Second.
Thanks for the motion, but this is not an action item, so we can't really take action on this. I am happy to have discussion about it today. Move it to our next meeting for action should the group appear to want to do that. And I think appreciate your statement and request, and we certainly will try to accommodate that as we go forward. Let's see, I have Joanne, did you want to add something?
My suggestion was going to be that we table the motion, and with that, if we are going to discuss this at the next meeting, that it be placed on the agenda to take this motion off the table for discussion.
I understand. I think I'll simply not accept the motion at this time, but with the explanation that I made. Ava?
Yeah, I was not.
I'm sorry, Ava, hold on just a second.
Sure.
There was some house cleaning here that we needed to do.
Sure.
Tom,
Sure.
the question that was posed was, can we make a motion to include some of those items?
That was not the motion.
To revisit the guiding principles.
Oh, yeah, and well, we could. At
But
the
we're
end,
not
when
doing that.
everybody else is somewhere on the list, I just have another question.
Okay,
Please, yeah.
all right, well, I'll get to you. All right. I think it's actually Carolyn is next and then Ava. Sorry, Ava.
Sure, no problem.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just on a couple of items that were brought up. I don't know if this is a question or a clarification for Jim DeGrood, but as I understand it, we are not restricted to projects that were submitted to by jurisdictions, right? So in our last plan, I just want to clarify, in the last plan, we had projects that were submitted by other than jurisdictions. In our transit subcommittee, we had a lot of discussion led by Suntran as to what their needs were. And then our committee decided what to recommend to the full CAC. And also the critical wildlife linkages were not something that was submitted by jurisdictions, the 45 million in that category. I can't recall off the top of my head if there were others, but my understanding is that we are not restricted to the list from the jurisdictions. And I just want to see if that is true.
Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, my belief is that you have a lot of latitude to bring forward a plan that you believe can be broadly supported by the voters.
Oh, thank you. I just want to make sure all the committee understood that too. And then the follow-up is about named projects. I mean, you kind of defined what they have been in the past, but can we have an entire ballot full of categoricals? Or could many of the categoricals that, such as what we had last time, include named projects? Or do you consider just the named projects being those in the roads and the transit?
Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, you have a lot of latitude in terms of what you put into the framework, what you establish as elements, and if you wanted to have a more broad sub-element that allowed for discretion over time in terms of selection of projects as priorities emerge, you have that. You also can identify projects that have specific scopes with them.
Okay, thanks. And just for some of our past discussions with the, before we added members, was we had discussion about flexibility because of future changes in mobility needs, and also because of climate change, but things like that about should we have more flexibility, or will the voters accept flexibility? Or do, you know, the voters, is it up to us in terms of how, that sounds like what you're saying, if we think the voters will adopt a flexible approach, or do they want certainty and all that? And we don't know that, but that's one of our charges, I think, to decide. And then, let's see, finally, I just want to also support Moss in her suggestion. We have a third of the members are new, and whether we make any changes to the guiding principles or not, I think that it's incumbent upon us as an entire committee to have ownership of those. There might be small changes suggested or large, I don't know, but as long as they fall under, you know, the statutory authority or guidelines or whatever, I think that we should be doing that when the time comes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Before I call on Ava, there is one person on the Zoom call who apparently is logged in on the Zoom, but is using their phone, perhaps because of an audio issue. Could you identify yourself just so we have the record corrected here? Aha. Busted. Very well, thanks. Ava.
I just wanted to echo what has been said about the framework, because some of these goals and sub-goals are not 100% self-evident, right? Maintaining or improving air quality could actually mean a number of things. So I'm hoping that, really just to echo that we have some really good dedicated time to unpack what these were intended to apply to exactly, and see if that really still holds true in terms of our current context.
Okay, thank you. Bruce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I kind of like to echo some of the sentiments today. I think Jim's presentation raises a number of issues about concepts and ideas. I have been repeatedly asking us, going back to the question about corridors, to take a very broad view of what is a corridor. There are transportation corridors, transit corridors, but there are also key commerce corridors. In what Jim presented, we have the opportunity to look at social and economic and other policy implications of what we do. So I do think that it is worth our while going back and revisiting that. And I would hope that during the section under agenda, we could take that up as an active agenda item going forward.
Thank you.
I think Bruce kind of covered. I was just trying to get clarification to ensure that it was actionable, because just to make sure that we don't get that. Is it called? I don't know. Just the technicality for why we can't move forward on this, even though it was discussed in the last meeting.
Okay.
Here, I don't know how to acknowledge I have an issue. I can't raise my hand. So if I speak, I'll just say quickly and you can count me on hand.
No problem. I've got almost 4 years of experience communicating with you.
All right. Can I ask?
And it's all been good. Feel free.
And just as a matter of order, I've said over and over to this point, right, on the construction standards that we use, I cannot reach a button press to go across a street at all. All right. And my wheelchair will raise up, but by the time it raises up, I press the button and get down that I can go across the street. The light has changed. I just want to point that out. As far as my ADA experience implementing in the state of New Jersey, there is no restriction against making it easier. The limit is that buttons can't be higher. And they specify 42, 40 inches, or whatever it is, but it doesn't mean if somebody can open a door handle, they should be able to press a button. All right. The other thing I have we ever asked I can't remember Monica, I can hear myself even. All right. All right. Is there, have we ever asked the jurisdictions to prioritize projects that are now in their jurisdiction? In other words, I'd like to know if that we put together the plan. You say, and the projects are in, and we have a certain number of projects per jurisdiction, et cetera, et cetera. All right. I'd like to know what those jurisdictions feel about that project list in priority order. And I'm saying more than some of the respectfully quibbling about some of the procedures. I think some of these things will work themselves out when we get into actually seeing the projects and going over them, which is our commandment to do. All right. Otherwise, it'll be 2026 before we even get to that point. But that's a respectful comment. But I would like to know, for instance, if we're looking at a project and we think it's important, and we think, oh, the agency thinks that's important, and it comes from a large or small jurisdiction, I'd like to know where that fits in the jurisdictional priority, because if it's low on 2 or 3, it may be a factor in our consideration.
Right, point taken. And that is the reason that we work together with the Technical Management Committee, which is made up of those jurisdictions, so that as we communicate back to them, as we can do, should this committee wish to do that, to ask them to prioritize or to look at types of projects that have higher ranking as far as they're concerned,
Yeah.
or a specific
Yeah, I'd like to know
projects.
what are the ones
all
that
of
are
those
most
things
important to them.
we
All right.
will certainly get that information.
And I say
from
that because I sense particularly some of the newcomers, is that when we did this before, we had a hostile, semi-hostile relationship with the agencies. I never sensed that at all. I don't ever look at us as trying to protect the agencies from being overrun by some bureaucratic stronghold of RTA. I mean, even Carol, who in terms of pursue wildlife and a whole bunch of other things that I may have not have thought in my own life, and maybe I thought not as important as some others. She managed to get her point across. All right. So, I mean, I do not think that that kind of attitude needs to be thought. We communicated pretty well, I thought, with the people we're serving.
That was very well said, and it echoes what I've been trying to say, but less eloquently, about welcoming the new members to our committee and allowing us to come together as a committee, allowing everyone a voice. All right, I have a comment from Rachel, and I'd like to wrap up this item after that.
Hi, thank you for recognizing me. I am just confused about the concrete definitions of corridors, elements, categories, functionality, regionality. I think it would be great if we had concrete definitions of them.
Would asphalt be okay instead of concrete? I'm sorry, that was not called for. Thank you, and I think as we further discuss our guiding principles and this regional framework, we will certainly dive in as deeply as we need to define those so that everyone understands what we're talking about, but more importantly, so that we can communicate it to the public as we develop a plan and take it to them. We tend, I think, when we get involved in transportation planning over a period of time to develop these shorthand linguistic styles that are largely jargon, and people don't necessarily know in the general public what we're talking about directly, even though we all communicate just fine. So keep us in line with that, and everyone think about ultimately who we're doing this for and who we're ultimately going to ask to ratify the work we've done. Abby, did you have a last comment?
I actually segued perfectly, Mr. Chair, which is that we talk a lot about what the voters have approved and what is acceptable to the voters. And I really hope that when we're looking at this plan holistically, we're not doing it for the minority of people who vote in a special election, but we're doing it regionally, multi-generationally, and that should be our guiding principle. And I appreciate what everybody said. I really appreciate what you've said, Tom. This all makes me very leery about reviewing individual projects at this point, because those are the last and smallest piece of a regional plan. So I don't feel prepared to do any project at this point. I think that and I'm sorry, I didn't get your name, Bruce. Really appreciate what you said as well. Appreciate what everybody has said. I think that we're looking at these tiny little elements. Oh, that's the wrong word. It's not an element. And projects, which are the smallest pieces of elements, which are the largest sub pieces of a plan. And I'm hoping that we can all keep that in mind. Just wanted to state that. And I don't know if we can get you like a computer with closed caption for next meeting. I don't know if anybody can for that.
What are we talking about?
So that you can hear everybody next meeting.
Oh, I can hear it, but I have no hearing problem.
Okay.
Believe me, if hearing were my only problem, I'd be dancing on the roof. Right?
My apologies. That's all I had. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for the conversation and the question.
Piece of information. I got a note from Diane Shiflett. She hasn't missed, I don't think she's missed a meeting yet. She's out of town for her father's funeral, and she thought she could get in virtual, like electronically in here, but she hasn't been able to. So she apologized that she's not here.
Oh, very good. Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on to item number 6, the review and discussion of the Auditor General's recommendations, specifically geared toward RTA Next and what that audit may tell us about the work that we have ahead of us.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the CAC. By statute, the Auditor General reviews the performance of both PAG and the RTA periodically. The statute says that at the 10th year, they would do their initial report, and then every 5 years thereafter. We have now completed our 15-year state performance audit, and within it, there were a number of recommendations. There were no findings. I know that for those of you that deal in the audit world, findings are bad, recommendations are expected. And that is where we're at. The audit was released on April 12th. It was sent to the governor, the president of the Senate, and the Speaker of the House, as well as all of the RTA board members. It has been posted online, so you're welcome to review it. You can see it on the RTA website. In fact, I think there's probably it's probably identified in the header there that it's a new piece of information. But the audit looked at, again, both PAG and RTA, comparing our transportation performance to peer communities. We looked at, I believe, 10 different communities. They were typically communities that are about our same size, Western or Southwestern, Fresno, Bakersfield, El Paso, Colorado Springs, Denver, Albuquerque. Those were the ones that come to mind that we were compared to. Again, the period that we were concerned with was the RTA period 3, which was between 2016 and 2021. The RTA plan itself is broken into 4 periods, each 5 years in duration. And they all, in fact, if you were to look at the RTA plan, you'd see that it would, like construction starts in period 1 or period 4. That was something that we have to show to or have to put into the RTA plan. At any rate, as I mentioned, there were no findings made, but there were 2 recommendations offered that pertain to both the current RTA and the RTA Next plan that we're now looking at. The first recommendation was that on an annual or more frequent basis, member jurisdictions be required to submit complete capital project cost estimates and actual expenditure data. It's one of the things, we are very, very careful on watching what RTA funds and other regional funds are flowing to a project, but we don't necessarily know what all of the other funds are that are coming into the region. So that's something that the Auditor General found, was that there were additional funds being brought to bear on various projects or funding that we weren't necessarily accounting for. So where we were representing a cost of a project, if the local jurisdiction or other brought other money in, it may have actually cost more than we said that it did. So that's something that they've asked us to work on monitoring better. And that's something that we will be doing. Also, it assists us in identifying properly what the estimated cost of a project is, so that on a going forward basis, when we're representing to the public what something costs, we'll have a better understanding of where all of the sources of funds are that are coming into to cover that. And we are also looking at closing out the remaining projects within the RTA, the current RTA plan, and we recognize that there is a funding gap. And this will assist us in identifying what that gap is. Both revenues and costs are very fluid right now, and that's something that we will be managing on a going forward basis. We have an obligation to respond to all of these recommendations, and the Auditor General will review our performance on these recommendations 1 year from now. So there will be a follow-up report on our performance. The same thing happened with the initial audit. We have taken the position, we've accepted the recommendations. We have the option not to. We can dispute them or say we're doing something differently, but we've said that we're in agreement with the recommendation. We find that the recommendation is good practice. And we're committed to using non-RTA regional funds to fully fund all of our regional or all of our RTA commitments on the roadway element projects. And in the face of new economic and financial uncertainty, it's even more important that we follow, strictly adhere to the current RTA plan. We are going to be continuing to work with our member jurisdictions to update cost estimates and looking at other non-RTA revenue sources that can be brought to bear on these projects so that we do deliver the projects as they were presented to the voters. This thing is not moving again. There we go. The second recommendation is to continue to work with our local jurisdictional partners to secure the needed RTA, non-RTA funding for RTA projects before and after the end of the RTA plan in 2026. That's to say that a number of our projects will likely not be started by the end of the RTA or will be just started. It's actually more just started. We expect to break ground on all of our projects between now and the end of the RTA, but they will go beyond that, and we will have the obligation to continue to look for funds to make sure that we're able to deliver these projects as they were scoped and presented to the voters. The response that we provided to the Auditor General was that we agreed to the recommendation and we will be implementing it. We will continue to go through with our jurisdictional partners to make sure that all of the funding that's been pledged to the project is actually realized. If there are other committed or officially earmarked local funds for the project, that they're being brought to bear. We look for other potential local funding or non-RTA funding to be brought to bear on the project. That if there are optional add-ons that have been brought into the project, the local jurisdictions have the ability to determine what the scope is of the project that they put out for construction. If they go beyond what's in the plan, we would expect them to bring additional funds to bear to go cover those additional optional expenses. And that's something that we've been working with our jurisdictional partners since day one in doing.
Hey, Jim, before you go off of this, it seems to me that much of the implementation of this recommendation is really board policy. That is things that our committee is not really empowered, I guess, to build into a plan necessarily. Does that make sense to you, or
totally makes
which
sense.
of this would you say is under our control? I would, assuming that it's little or none of it, it would certainly be worth hearing the board's direction on these items as we go forward.
Mr. Chair, thank you. I appreciate that comment.
I see Farhad has his hand up.
Oh, okay.
Perhaps he'd like to chime in on this.
Sure, Mr. Chair, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you fine.
Yes, thank you. Good point. And one of the reasons we want to really summarize these two recommendations was just to make sure that you are aware of those and how it really applies to RTA next is really when it comes down to funding of the projects. As Jim mentioned, some of these projects are not only funded by RTA dollars. They are supplemented by state, federal, local dollars. So that's really the takeaway, to make sure that any projects that you include in RTA next to have all those supplemental fundings identified as well.
Okay, well, thank you. And then the only other point that I really wanted to make is that we need to continue to be sure that, if there are ineligible items, we need to continue to make sure that we're identifying them and making sure that the funding for those ineligible items is with the appropriate entities that, for instance, utilities and others that would be responsible for those improvements. And with that, that concludes my comment on that. I would have mentioned again that this audit is available online at both the Auditor General's website and our website, and it includes our response at the very end of it to the recommendations that were made.
Thank you, Jim. I do have some questions parked here, and I believe the first one is from Bruce. We have 4.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
I'd like to ask a question, but I think Arlen had his hand up first.
I will yield the mic.
Thank you. I saw it fourth, so, yeah. So question I have, I spent a lot of time reading the audit report, found it really important and impactful, and I would urge everybody in the committee to do so. But to this last question about fulfilling the promise that was made in the current RTA, is the issue of policy issue of whether we're going to carry over projects that are not completed into RTA Next and use funding from RTA Next to complete those projects. And I think that's a really big issue because it then limits the amount of money we have for the other projects going forward. And I didn't quite get what the response was from Jim, you and Farhad about that issue. Is it anticipated that the policy decision or recommendation is to try to resolve all those issues with local funds and existing sources that are now identifiable, or is there some sense that they may carry over into the next version of RTA?
Farhad, would you like to address that?
Yes, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Thank you, Bruce. As you recall, RTA board recently had a conversation about how we are able to provide an overlap between the current RTA and RTA Next. So that kind of goes back to the comment that Tom made earlier. That's a policy decision for the RTA board to determine how that overlap is going to work financially. And then, as you recall, we've discussed about developing a budget for RTA Next. That again is a policy decision by the board. So at that point, the board will determine what is the target budget for RTA Next, and then that would be communicated to the CAC as well. Again, from our perspective, as Jim mentioned earlier, these projects can all be accomplished beyond 2026 as needed using other funding. We know we can utilize federal funds, state funds, local funds, and RTA Next is part of that solution as well. But to what extent, that's completely up to the board to make that determination.
Thank you. I'll go with Arlen next. I'm sorry, I may have gotten this out of order. I'm not going to miss anyone, but I may not get you in the correct order.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Arlen, could you use the microphone a little bit more directly there?
I'm going to knock it off here. Is what I'm going to do. Yeah. Thank you.
Use your outside voice.
Yeah. So in recommendation number 1, 2 questions come up as a result. One of them is in the response to recommendation 1, and the other is which I'll start with a general question. It talked about monies coming in from member jurisdictions that support these projects. Carolyn had mentioned in previous conversation about there were projects in RTA that came about not from member jurisdictions, but from other entities. Those projects that came about from other entities, are they now in there because they've been adopted and sponsored by a member jurisdiction, or are they still independent and recommendation number 1 doesn't apply to those that don't come from member jurisdictions? That may be a technicality, but I don't understand that.
If I can, Mr. Chair, Mr. Colton, just very quickly on that particular point, the the remaining roadway element projects have all been sponsored by local lead agencies. So I don't see a disconnect in that particular point that you're making.
Are there non-roadway element programs that were in that category that are, or that are not coming under a member jurisdiction?
All of the roadway projects or all of the projects that we are delivering, with the exception of some small study types of projects that are done by outside agencies, have been done by lead agencies that are jurisdictional members of the RTA. So even if they are, I'll give an example. I know we're doing some wildlife projects. Those projects are being delivered by either the Arizona Department of Transportation or some other entity, local government entity that the project lies within their jurisdictional boundaries. The only other item would be in cases where we have studies to follow up on things where we may contract directly with, say, Game and Fish to monitor the performance of the wildlife improvements or analyze things that are related to the performance measures that we want to use.
Jim, would you say that's also true of the Main Street program? Was that a city housed or county housed?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. The Main Street program, which is our business assistance program, is a project delivered by the RTA. We actually have staff who oversee contracts for those consultants that are working on that for us.
So my second question in the slide, in response to.
You want me to go back to that slide?
Yeah, that'd probably be good.
I can back it up here.
Number one.
Number one, okay. I'm trying to go, but there we go. That's the response.
That's it.
Okay.
Okay, bullet number one.
Okay.
It says, it makes the specific mention that RTA board's committed to regional funds to fully fund RTA commitments on roadway element projects. Things that are not roadway element projects. I don't know how many or what those would be because I don't remember. But if there are, if there aren't, no problem. But if there are, does that mean that they're not committed to using those regional funds for non-roadway element projects? Or is that just a semantical thing that I'm looking at? I just want to know what that means.
You know, Mr. Chair, Mr. Colton, when we look at the categorical projects, well, first of all, in terms of the roadway element program, which is about 60, just under 60% of the overall program, and where we see the vast majority of the remaining projects that we need to deliver are within the roadway element. We do have ongoing transit obligations that we have programmed into the plan already and that we believe we're going to be able to continue to deliver on. In terms of the categorical projects, again, there are no scopes that we have identified in the RTA plan and presented to the voters. There were blocks of funding and we have delivered projects as those funds have been made available. So the number of, we do have some continuing projects that we've committed to and that are in the plan, and we do expect those to be delivered.
Farhad, did you want to?
Yes, Mr. Chair, if I may just add to that. As you recall, I believe Jim had presented on this previously. Those individual sub-elements, they were identified as targeted goals. And we had, for example, so many intersections or so many pedestrian crossings, so many bus pullouts. So those numbers have already been met, or they're definitely will be met within the next 4 years. So in terms of projects and the number of projects that have been committed that are non-roadway projects, those are all going to be met. And that's why it was phrased the way it was, because as Jim mentioned, there are only 11 roadway projects that are still either in design or go into construction. So the focus of the recommendation was mostly on the roadway projects.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Mr. Chair, Moss, what we have been working with the jurisdictions on is a cost to complete. And this is an ongoing monthly or every meeting, it's a standing item on our agendas with both our
Jim,
technical
I think
management.
she's talking about RTA next.
For all, I'm sorry, for RTA next. I stand correct. Could you restate the? Uh-huh.
Even to agenda item 7, for example, but not talking about agenda item 7, of course. You know, when we're looking at projects and we're evaluating and ultimately going to prioritize them, will we have information about how much jurisdictions are going to be able to commit to those projects?
Excellent question. And with the last plan, we asked how much money the jurisdictions would bring to bear. And that's a commitment that's actually in our administrative code. We would expect to do the same with this plan as well. You know, if they believe that they can bring funds to bear, we'll have a cost estimate. And if there's RTA funds and other funds, those will all be identified in the RTA plan, the next plan.
Mr. Chair, if I may add to that.
Sure, go ahead, Barb.
The submitted list of projects, and we do have a spreadsheet. Hopefully you've received that spreadsheet. We did ask that question, and there's already been non-RTA dollars committed to the list of projects that have been submitted. A really good example to look at are the interstate I-10 improvements. If you look at those, and I think we had previously done the math on that, roughly 50% of the commitments are being made by non-RTA dollars for those projects, and the balance that they're requesting are for RTA dollars. So that's just an example that if you look at your spreadsheet and the cost, they should have already been broken down and identified for non-RTA commitments.
Yeah, thank you for asking, Mr. Chair. We sent a link to the list of projects. It's not necessarily in a spreadsheet form. Let me check and see how we, because when we send a PDF, it reformats it and it's difficult to see. So we sent the presentation list, but I have had requests for the submitted project list to be sent in a more user-friendly way. So, but I just want to clarify it's a link, not a spreadsheet that you've received.
Okay, we still have 5 questions parked. I'm going to get each of those questions asked, but I do want to move on to our next item as well. But I'm going to ask the question I asked a few minutes ago. If there's someone on the Zoom call who's also logged in with their phone, perhaps for an audio on their Zoom, just so we can keep the record straight here of attendance. Uh, 520-437-3727.
The question I have is, do we expect to have gathered the targeted revenue that we estimated against all the projects, or that we applied all the projects to? Do we estimate by the end of 2026, how much of that under or over do we expect to have achieved? Because the reason I'm saying that, if we planned projects for 2.1 billion and we only collected 1.9, there's obviously some projects, even on our best estimates 20 years ago, that will not be able to be completed. For that really reason, we don't have the revenue base in order to complete them. And so I think that needs to be looked at. The other thing that I am relating to what's said here is that at some point, and maybe not now, the board will have determined what projects or what overlap, the amount of the overlap that is necessary. To me, I'd like to look at that overlap that's necessary and compare it to the same estimate of what we are over or under in revenue. Because a big reason that we may not be able to complete it is we didn't get enough money in sales tax to complete the job. And if that's the case, and even if we should be able to commit to the project, it would seem, to the part that's 2026, if there is money available, rather than say that it's part of RTA Next, why can't we just reserve funds that complete at least the priority of those projects? I mean, I don't think we have all the information right now to make those decisions, but I'm not sure that the circumstances is at the moment, from what's discussion, going to be a grave problem or perhaps a minor problem. And I'd like to try to put that context.
Yeah, I understand the question, and it's largely going to revolve around a policy decision by the board. Farhad, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you again. Good question, Tom. So again, as we mentioned earlier, the RTA board used non-RTA dollars. These are state dollars and federal dollars that come to the region to make up for that difference. They have already met the total amount that was obligated for all the projects. That's already been met. What we're talking about now moving forward is additional cost for cost increases of the projects that may need additional funding. And those funds would have to come from non-RTA sources as well.
Oh, see here? What's that? This came off at some point and no one ever replaced it.
Yeah.
Roger, you're mute. You are unmuted for the moment. Please mute your phone.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Anyhow, so going back to Tom's question, yes, we'll have that information for you as far as a budget to program to for RTA Next, as well as how much of that budget would be needed, if any, for RTA Next, additional supplemental funding needed. But as I said earlier, the board has already met their commitment for the current RTA plan. Anything that they bring to the table would be to supplement that with RTA Next if there are any additional projects that need to overlap with RTA Next.
Thank you. Okay, we have Carolyn, and then Chris, and then Rachel.
I do have a question, follow-up question to Bruce's, but first I just want to say to Tom and everyone that the tax revenue forecast in 2006 did change drastically in 2008. And what the RTA board did, as I understand it, is to do a percentage cut on all of the numbers that appeared on the ballot for all of the categoricals except for, all the categoricals. And I think that the transit might have already been finished, but the roadway projects, they did not cut the amount that was on the ballot. So that was one way that it was done, and I don't think that that money is going to come back to those categoricals. It was more of a percentage. But my question in it, I really had the same exact question as Bruce, and I don't fully understand the answer. And Farhad, if you could tell us again, because the response to recommendation number 1 says RTA board is committed to using non-RTA regional funds to fully fund all RTA commitments on roadway element projects. So that response says to me, we are not going to see any of the 2006 roadway project move ahead and get put into RTA next. Is that, because I don't think that's what you said.
No, if you go back to the recommendation, Jim, please.
Yeah, we are.
Yeah.
No, the
That's
recommendation
the
itself,
response.
Oh,
not the response.
oh, okay. There.
So the recommendation itself, the request is to make sure that we identify all the funds that are programmed for each project, and that includes non-RTA committed dollars. So our response was that we will do that on annual basis or even more frequently to be able to determine how much revenue, including non-RTA revenue, is committed to the project, and then at the same time obtain updated cost estimates so we can analyze cost increases associated with those projects, so we can make sure that the revenue matches the potential cost of the project. So that's really just to make sure that it's consistent with what the recommendation is. So what does that mean in practice is that we're going to have to monitor the projects, we're going to have to update the cost estimates, and then we need to make sure that the revenues that are committed to the projects are secured and provided regardless of where the source of that revenue is. It could be state dollars, it could be federal dollars, it could be local dollars, impact fees, or RTA dollars.
But the response says very clearly non-RTA regional
Correct.
fund.
This is correct.
And it also says fully fund, and it also says all roadway projects. That's why that's what's confusing, because you just said something different than it is in your response to the Auditor General.
Again, it goes back to the question that Arlen had. The remaining 4 years, we're only focusing on the audit's recommendation for the roadway element projects because they identified those as remaining projects to complete. And then along those lines, they also identified that RTA has already met its commitment to the ballot amount. What has not been met are non-RTA dollars, which we need to demonstrate that those are available as well.
Okay, I don't quite understand, but I'm sure I will someday.
Okay, good.
The ballot amount shown in the 2006 ballot has already been fully committed and programmed. So that's not what they're asking for. They're asking for any other non-RTA dollars that still need to come to the project.
Okay, let's move on. Chris? I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Go ahead and take the questions from.
Okay. Thanks. Rachel?
Yes, hello, thank you. I actually had the same question Carolyn had, the same questions. And I also didn't understand Farhad's answer. I'm sorry. And I know, Carolyn, it sounds like you just kind of said, well, hopefully I'll understand it. I'd like to press Farhad actually to explain it again because I really don't. I don't understand.
I'll be happy to, Mr. Chair, if I may.
Certainly.
Okay, so again, thank you for the question, and I appreciate asking again. So RTA ballot amount committed by the ballot. This is the entire program. We have been able to program everything that's been committed by the ballot in the current 5-year plan. By definition, all the RTA dollars that have been committed will be spent by 2026. What the audit asked for was, now that the cost of the projects potentially have increased, how are we going to bring new dollars to be able to pay for the additional cost increases? And the response was that those new dollars would have to be from non-RTA sources, state dollars, federal, and local funds. And that's what we're communicating right now with all of our partners, to be able to identify how those non-RTA dollars are going to be committed to the projects within the next 4 years. I hope that answers the question.
It doesn't. Do you mean that the RTA claims to deliver categorical projects that are paid for by non-RTA regional funds?
Back in 2014, the RTA board committed using state, federal, and any other funding sources that comes to the region to meet the RTA's commitment. And that's what we've done so far. So they may not be RTA sources, but they are commit plan.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Farhad.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. It didn't answer my question.
Okay, maybe you should restate the question.
Okay, I'm sorry. My question is, does this mean that the RTA claims to deliver categorical projects that are paid for by non-RTA regional funds?
Yes, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, in 2014, RTA board pledged non-RTA dollars. Those are state dollars and federal dollars that come to the region, to use those dollars to be able to deliver those categorical projects, as well as named roadway projects.
So I'm sorry, the amount of money spent on is the amount of money spent on the categoricals lower than what was promised on the ballot? Because it seems like you're counting the roadway projects in the categorical completions, but what does it look like when you remove the roadway projects?
So the categorical projects were identified by numbers of so many intersections, for example, so many bus pullouts, so many pedestrian crossings. We've accomplished by delivering those projects, and in many cases, shortly after the recession, there was actually a very relatively competitive environment for bidding. So we actually delivered those projects under budget. And we'll be happy to present on those categorical projects at a later time to demonstrate that we had delivered those numbers as we promised. So what's remaining are only 11 projects, roadway projects in the plan that we're trying to complete within the next 4 years. And that's really the focus of these two recommendations. The recommendation was mainly on those 11 projects.
Okay, so I just want to clarify one more time. Non-RTA dollars have been committed to fulfill the RTA's ballot obligations.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Karen.
So many questions. So I was under the impression that we had a budget, and this is moving forward with this particular CAC committee. I was under the impression we had a budget, and the budget might be a little fluid based on, the economy and changes, but it's a budget based on the 50-cent sales tax dedicated to RTA projects. And now what we're being asked to do is to prioritize those projects because we can't do them all because we don't have enough money. And so we're saying, all right, we want to do these projects, but not these because we don't have the money to say yes to everybody. But now what I'm hearing you say is that there's a whole nother source of funding called non-RTA funding that is out there that we don't know about, or we do know about, but we're not being told what it is. So yeah, that's the part that is, do we have a budget or not? And do we know what the non-RTA funds are available for the budgets or the projects we're saying yes and no to going forward?
Just to reiterate, when the Great Recession hit and the amount of revenue that was going to be collected over the 20-year period was clearly going to be less, the jurisdictions of the RTA all got together as the board of the RTA and decided to commit all these other sources of funding to make up the amount of money needed to build everything that was included. And that's what Farhad has been describing as these additional sources of money. And so those have been already pledged. Farhad, go ahead.
Yeah, if I may, Mr. Chair, if I understood Karen's question, again, we're talking about current plan versus the new plan, where I think your question was, you're 100% correct. With the new plan, you will receive a budget from the board. As part of that budget, we will continue to work with any sponsor for any project to make sure that if they are committing any non-RTA dollars, that non-RTA dollar is included and added to the RTA budget. So just to put it in perspective, currently you have $4.5 billion worth of projects. RTA may only bring $2 billion to the table. If the partners bring an additional $2.5 billion of non-RTA funds to the project, then you have a $4.5 billion plan and a revenue to go with it. We all know that that's going to be difficult. That's why you need to narrow it down to match what the commitments are, both RTA and non-RTA commitments.
So at some point, we will know how much the non-RTA commitments will be so that we can choose our projects with non-RTA money and RTA money in mind.
Yes, absolutely. And that was, thank you again, because that was really the point of these two recommendations, that as a CAC, as you develop the next plan, we need to ensure that those non-RTA dollars are identified and committed to.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Joanne.
I believe that the questions have been asked and answered and explained by Farhad. Since we as a committee are not involved with the additional funds or their sources, that is not a matter for the CAC. I ask that this discussion be closed.
All right, this is a learning experience for our committee, and I think learning about the current RTA is important. I'll allow another question about this because I think that recognizing the history will hopefully allow us to more seamlessly move into the future, understanding what the issues are. I have a question online from Ava, and then Chris, and I think Abby may get the last word. Okay, Ava.
So I want to double check that I understand this properly. It is possible that the RTA board may request that projects that weren't able to be fully completed in RTA 1 be moved into RTA Next. However, we're not asking jurisdictions for priorities. Therefore, a project from 20 or plus years ago could be moved into the current slate, and it might be outdated. And we won't have the opportunity to get that feedback from the jurisdictions in terms of what their current priorities are today. Is that correct? Am I understanding this correctly?
Not exactly. If the board were to send forward projects into RTA Next, they would define those projects because they would become a part of the ballot. So, I would presume that they would be updated as much as they needed to be, both in terms of their budget, that is the amount of construction and development costs, as well as their scopes. So I think that would be taken care of moving forward. Chris.
Sure. In terms of the recommendations, this seem reasonable in this one. One of the things that in the recommendation, I want to make sure I'll hear about, talking about the budget that's from the RTA board. However, assumptions built into that budget assume carrying forward the existing tax rate. And we have the authority under the statute to change that tax rate. So I want to make sure that we are not artificially constraining the conversations at the CAC with regard to the funds available, because part of our responsibility is to assess whether or not the revenue that's available to us, we make and include in our recommendation. Part of that recommendation number 2 to the Auditor General includes the mix of revenue that's available. And part of that mix of revenue could be, as approved and recommended by the CAC, to vet with the public, is increasing the revenue generated by the tax.
Yeah, obviously that budget that you described is somewhat fluid as far as that very question, which is a policy question that the board only can make a decision about. Certainly during our conversations, we were to come up with a list that we couldn't cut. We could ask the board to consider raising that revenue, but they may also contact us first to say the jurisdictions wish to, let's say, add an amount of money over and above the half-cent, specifically for some purpose, say maintenance or some other. So between us, between the RTA board and the CAC, that question will be answered. And certainly, I think it'll be at least answered tentatively so that when we do send a plan out to the public, we have that information available, because I agree with you. I think it's a huge part of the decision-making process by a voter, as well as these jurisdictions, about how to take care of the shortfalls they have in their needs.
Mr. Chair, one more. And
I have Abby first, Tom.
Sure.
Have one question. I think that Carolyn might have been asking this question as well among the bigger questions, but we were told that all of the soft projects were completed, and that included like pedestrian projects, and that the Main Street program, which was business assistance, had been completed. I'm confused about how we have remaining roadway projects that don't incorporate those elements, categories. I don't know what we're calling them. To me, it's weird that we're considering them to be separate. And I am hoping that, safety and economic vitality and environmental sustainability are all incorporated into every single roadway project. Otherwise, we end up with, bike lanes on streets that nobody wants to bike on, but no bike lanes on the streets that people do bike on, and things like that. So I just wanted to clarify that we are still considering, hopefully, those aspects. I use the word aspects. Those aspects of projects in our roadway projects. Can somebody clarify that for me?
Go ahead, Jim.
Mr. Chair,
You definitely incorporate within our roadway element projects those other components. So I know at the risk of branding them complete streets. I guess that's what I need to do we include within our major roadway element projects, pedestrian improvements. We include bicycle improvements. They're all scoped and they are in the administrative code saying that they are. I think if I had it to do over again, I would have probably not labeled it roadway element. I would have probably labeled it multi-use corridors, because that's what they are. And when we do our projects, we also have a road safety analysis that we bring a separate group of our team from the PAG side of the house in to take a look at the projects with professionals that weren't involved in the development of the project to give their own observations on how to make the roadways more safe. So these are the the categoricals, or the safety element and the environmental and economic vitality element projects, are over and above what's already in the roadway element.
I have one comment, really. This question is extraordinarily important coming up for the vote on the next one, because I know through my 20-year, 15-year experience, I've said everything on my card experience that we were going to commit, do what we said we were going to do. And so I would like to compliment the RTA board that they're spending such consideration on this, because I wish all those bond issues that never ever got fulfilled, the people paid as much attention to committing those projects that were on those bond issues that we put in this plan. And I know RTA has put those project reviews, remember the technical reviews, to try to save, done a whole bunch of things from what my experience is to keep those projects where they are. And but we can't control the overall economy and certain other kinds of things. And that was understood when we were funding projects with sales tax. And so therefore there will be problems, but it's extraordinarily important. And I think I got that from the board and you, that issue be resolved and very clear, because otherwise we'll be the subject of a negative smear campaign. And these projects will never go forward. Another $2 billion. That's all this region needs to lose, is another $2 billion on roads. And we'll be back in cattle trains in the next 20 years.
Right. Thanks for your comments, Tom.
Thank you.
I agree with you that it's a critical part of perhaps the underpinning foundation of this committee, as a matter of fact. We have a last comment here. I just want to let people know we have gone beyond our aim for 1 o'clock completion, but these have been some really important conversations. I am going to table item number 7 and ask Rick Ellis again to come back. Rick, my apologies.
Feel popular around the people here. So.
This is on the, your chair failed you again. But we'll get you early in the agenda next time so that we're able to actually get into some of the conversations we want to have with you.
And you get 2 lunches.
And then we will have one other item, which is our future agenda items, which we'll get to in a moment or two. So last comment is Moss.
I think I noticed that there was a difference in what some of the categorical element categories that were included in the original ballot, like safety and some of those fits, not the roadway projects, that the dollar amount that was on the ballot was different than what was in the auditor report. Do I have that straight? Like it was like a, maybe like $100 million difference or something? Is that accurate?
Mr. Chair, Moss, I don't know what the specific dollar is off my head or off the top of the head. We could take a look at it. What we were looking at primarily was looking at the promises that we made associated with those categorical commitments, if you will, the number of intersections that we'd improve, the number of crossings that we'd improve, the number of miles of sidewalk and bike lane. Those are the things that we were really focusing on more so than the dollar amount. We did enjoy very, very good pricing in the early years of the recession. We took advantage of it. Those were projects that were easily implemented while we were waiting to develop the major projects, which take a long time to develop. And at the same time as we were going in recession, we tried to deliver as many of these smaller projects as we could. I think we did a pretty good job.
So, but it sounds like there were funds left over then because you got a good
There
rate?
are,
Or there were funds
yeah.
that were originally designated for those those categories, but because you got a good rate, that money wasn't ultimately, all that money wasn't ultimately spent on those categories.
That's correct. It was not.
Okay, and where did they go?
Pardon me?
Where did that money go towards?
That money is, well, the money didn't go anywhere. It's still with the board. And what the board has is the ultimate decision on how to use those funds. Right now, there's a pool of funds that are over and above the amount that are necessary to meet the ballot amounts, but there are project costs that go beyond that. It'll be up to the board to decide how they use this.
Okay, thank you. And so I think my last question on this, were the number of projects and intersections, everything that you were saying were the targets that you had, were those voter?
Those were represented in the ballot
Okay.
or in the voter materials. Those were part of the pledge.
And I guess I'm curious why there wasn't, what was the decision-making process for not like further, we can always do veteran safety, right? There's, right, in Tucson, I think we just have a stat of that there was 90 pedestrian fatalities this year so far. Maybe anybody can fact check that, but I'm just curious, what was the rationale for not continuing to invest in safety elements up to the maximum dollar that we could?
Well, there are safety elements that are also included in the roadway element project. So it's not that we're not investing in it. It's just that we're focusing on delivering what the voters voted on. So that, we've met certain milestones that we promised. We have other promises that we still need to meet. And that's where the board is. The board ultimately has the discretion as to how they want to spend the money. But at this point in time, we've been recommending that we complete the projects that are promised that are still yet to be delivered.
Okay, Farhad, did you want to?
Mr. Chair, I just want to add to what Jim said. So we did not collect the revenues that were anticipated. So when we're talking about how much funds were available, we did not collect the anticipated RTA revenues. So those funds were never realized. In exchange, we used non-RTA dollars to do what we promised. So the actual numbers obviously are not really the focus for us. The focus was to meet those promises and be able to finish those intersections and finish those pedestrian crossings and the pull-outs and everything else based on the numbers we promised. So the revenue itself was never realized. That's why there is a difference between the dollar amounts.
Very good, thank you. Okay, we're going to move on now to agenda item number 8, which is future agenda items. I wanted to point out that I have a master list of your suggestions and requests, and continue to work through those the best that we can, and in order that makes sense for our efficient progress of our work. Today, we have heard from the public and from members of the committee requested agenda item for revisiting our guiding principles and some specifics about those guiding principles regarding climate change, equity, and mobility justice, perhaps being added to that list of priorities. And so I have that. Are there any other items for the agenda? Rachel?
Hi, thank you. Yes, first of all, you have the running list of potential agenda items. I would love that those be made public, so we can see which items were suggested and then which items you, Tom, as chair, decided maybe not to include on the agenda. That way there's more transparency. So there's that. Also, I think we should develop concrete definitions of the words that we're using. Again, functionality, element, those words that we can't seem to, corridors, for example, regionality, because we can't get any work done unless we have a common vocabulary. So I would love for that to be on the next agenda.
All right, thank you for that. Ava?
Yes, I just wanted to stress that the review and reevaluation of the priorities of the RTA plan are really important to me in terms of discussing, revisiting, unpacking, and looking at in depth, because everything that we're going to do moving forward will hinge upon these priorities.
Very good, thank you. Abby?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really appreciate you bringing that up. I agree with that being on a future agenda. A couple of people today suggested weighting projects, and I hope that we consider weighting or scale or priority to be part of how we revisit, because I know there's a lot of little pieces, and seeing where they all go in terms of our holistic regional plan, I think is something that we should revisit.
You say revisit, and
Or
what do you mean
visit
by
when
that?
we're looking at our
Yeah.
priorities, that we not only create regional priorities, but that we create a way to we prioritize our priorities, and that we have a way that the individual jurisdictions and other interests can kind of help us weigh what is the most important to us as a regional cohesive body.
And given that, any feedback we could get from the technical management committee about that, I've heard from this committee would be helpful. Perhaps that's something that Mr. Bernal can take back to the TMC.
Be glad to do that, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, John.
Chair, I have some procedural questions and comments about the agenda. I guess I'm concerned about how the agenda is set. In the past, we've had agenda items requested. I've requested a number that have never seen the light of day. It's sort of been a mystical process for me. As we move more into the citizen component of this as opposed to the staff component, I'd really like to understand how agenda items are going to be set. Are they set by the chair and the two vice chairs? Are they set by staff? How are priorities put on agenda items so that they are relevant to the committee members? And my second procedural question is that we had been asked to reserve dates every 2 weeks on our calendar, but then it seems like we meet only once a month. I know for me, it's challenging to hold dates and then only get a week's notice. Seems to me that given the amount of work that we have to do every 2 weeks for a period of time until we get to the summer break would be very helpful. And it'd be really helpful to understand when those meetings are going to occur.
The summer break started today, didn't it?
Well, even beginning in the fall, if we're going to go back, I just think, having 1 month and then going 2, and then it's very difficult for us who have other things on our calendars to understand with a week's notice. So I would hope you could at least address both those questions.
I agree. Thank you. Any other items for the agenda? Boss.
Requested the revisiting of the guiding principles. That would be an action item where we would be discussing and taking action upon making the update. So I just really want to make clear in this moment, because I know I think Ava and Rachel also brought it up, but making sure that it's when we bring back the guiding principle discussion, it is to take an action on it.
Yes.
And not just an informational piece. And I think that it also is going to need to be like a multiple working session discussion if we're going to be adding in definitions and other such things.
That was certainly my intent. Thanks for clarifying that.
Mr. Chair. Related to that. I think take discussion. Recommendations to you. What they would be, so that we have a pretty good idea, rather than just have a general discussion.
I'm sorry, we can't hear that.
Yeah, the comment was it would be helpful for members of the committee who want to make modifications or changes or additions to the guiding principles to forward those to the chair, to staff beforehand, so that we're able to be aware of that and have time for those individual conversations to be captured. All right. Thank you all very much. Appreciate you staying beyond our targeted 2-hour time. I think it's been a very good meeting, and we are hereby adjourned.
Oh, no. Oh,
Oh, Rachel, I'm sorry.
oh, thank you. Thank you for coming back. I'm so sorry to postpone our ending, but I was wondering if we could please put on the agenda, how does the RTA track and factor in inflation?